We ready to go here?
Go ahead.
Thank you. If you could advance the slide. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our session. Thanks for being with us. My name is Dan Johnson, and I'm Vice President and National Partner for Brownfields Redevelopment at SCS Engineers. My co-speakers and colleagues for this talk are Janie Davis. She's the Deputy Executive Director with the California Pollution Control Financing Authority. Diane Barclay, the head of the Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Fund, Assistant Deputy Director for the Division of Financial Assistance with the State Water Resources Control Board, and Marcus Niebank, who's a principal with Amicus Strategic Environmental Consulting. Next slide, please. What we'd like to share with you today is a perspective on brownfields redevelopment, but more importantly, a perspective on what funding could do, or more importantly, maybe a consistent source of funding for brownfields, and what policy initiatives or changes might be able to happen within the state of California to facilitate better funding sources, more consistent, and what would the result of that be? My hypothesis is that the result would be a significant win, that there is in fact very significant return on investment for every dollar invested in a brownfields redevelopment project. If we could get a 15 or a 16 to 1 return, which is not uncommon for brownfields projects, why wouldn't we find ways to invest that money? So I'll do a little bit of setting the stage here, and then I'm going to hand it off to my colleagues who are going to give you some details about some potential funding sources, existing funding sources, and some exciting potential legislation. And these sources total actually in excess of $100 million of potential funding for brownfield sites. So it's pretty significant. Let's talk a little bit about the current situation with COVID and the state's budget crisis. If you go back to the Great Recession, the last time we had a budget crisis and we had in excess of $20 billion worth of a budget deficit, I think everybody looked at each other and said, oh my God, this is awful. We've never seen anything like this. And now you fast forward to the end of 2019, and the projections for the budget cycle at that time were $5.6 billion worth of surplus. We had $17 billion in the piggy bank, thank goodness, the rainy day fund. And then COVID happens. And we're swimming in a sea of red ink for the 2-year budget cycle, a $54 billion budget deficit, unheard of, unprecedented, absolutely amazing in a bad way, right? So the budget revise in May comes out. The problem with the budget revise is that there's a $14 billion placeholder in it, basically with duct tape and baling wire, as we're hopeful for federal funding to come in and fill the gap. And so that, I think, in the grand scheme of things, ranges from the thought of being challenging all the way to wishful thinking. Next slide, please. And I should say that doesn't include the deficits in funding for municipalities, cities, estimated to be $8 billion. So we have a sea of red ink in the state of California across many fronts. We set the stage for housing. How are we doing for housing? You've been hearing a lot about that at this conference. And I, for one, am a true believer that there's a nexus between brownfields and housing, and more in particular, affordable housing. California ranks 49th out of 50 states in affordability. By various estimates, somewhere between 3 and 3.5 million housing units short. There's an intrinsic budget gap or deficit that's never really been filled once redevelopment went away in 2012, 2013, the redevelopment monies disappeared. Intrinsic funding gap of, depending on who you talk to, somewhere between $1 and $2 billion a year. So the question that I would ask, and that we've been talking about as a group, is, are California's policies consistent with best practices And can we do more to promote housing solutions leveraging brownfields redevelopment? And my answer is an emphatic, hell yes, we can. There's a lot more that we can do. California likes to think of itself as being a leader in many areas with respect to policy and funding. If you happen to attend the session that I moderated at the EPA conference in LA, I moderated a similar session to this, but we had a retrospective across the United States looking at brownfields and housing policies and what other states are doing. And I just have to say that what other states are doing is a lot more creative, both in terms of funding, as well as in terms of policy, in terms of encouraging brownfields redevelopment and conversion into affordable housing. Next slide, please. How about the number of brownfield sites? So if we agree with the hypothesis that we could convert brownfield sites into affordable housing, which of course we can, then how many are out there? And so unfortunately, the estimates aren't very good. There's still the national estimate that was done by the GAO in 2004, 450,000 nationally. Is that really a million? Question mark. California, the only study that I could find that actually had some systematic research associated with it was done by CCLEAR. It was done in 2007. The estimate at that time was 100,000 to 200,000 sites. I'm not aware of any newer data. If anybody is, please let me know. By the way, if somebody is aware of a graduate program and we could task some graduate students with doing this research, that would be absolutely brilliant. It would be so helpful to the policy conversation to have a handle on how many sites we have in California. If we look at the number of sites that you could perhaps convert to affordable housing by virtue of zoning, appropriate development attributes, those sorts of things, doing a little bit of work, we could say maybe 10 to 20% of those sites could be converted. So you've got somewhere between 10 and 40,000 sites that could be converted, brownfield sites that could be converted into affordable housing. So it's not the answer to the affordable housing problems in the state of California, but is it an answer? For sure it is. It's certainly part of the answer and solution. So what do we find with our current situation and what are we lacking? I think what we're lacking is a consistent funding source for brownfields, and this isn't a knock on the EPA funding or what DTSC does. That's certainly helpful, but more significant funding than that, particularly with an nexus to affordable housing. And then I guess I would say particularly with an emphasis on early at-risk, I'll call it diagnostic work, or if you're a developer, soft cost work, when you're looking at a site to develop, all other things being equal, and you're going to risk your soft cost money, you don't have funding yet. If you could have a forgivable loan or a grant to investigate sites, these soft costs are truly important to have some sort of certainty for reimbursement. I think that would be very helpful. In fact, CALREUSE had a program like that in the past. CCLEAR used to administer a part of it. My firm used to as well. And by all accounts, it was a rousing success. So with that, I'd like to make a transition to our next speaker. I'd like to introduce Janie Davis, and she's going to tell you a little bit about the program CALREUSE and what they've been able to do with brownfields funding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate that introduction and you teeing me up to talk about the CALREUSE program. My name is Janie Davis, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the California Pollution Control Financing Authority. We're a financing authority within the State Treasurer's Office.
Change the slide, please.
Yes, thank you. Next. We're a financing authority within the State Treasurer's Office. We were established in 1973 as a conduit issuer for tax-exempt pollution control bonds. We used the fees that we assessed from these bond issuances. We've used them several ways to help stimulate environmental cleanup, economic development, and job growth in the state of California. Through our tax-exempt bond program, we've used those fees to administer credit enhancement programs and grants and loans towards that end. Initially we provided for our Small Business Assistance Fund, and that Small Business Assistance Fund, we use those fees to help small businesses who are issuing bonds, help them pay for the cost of issuance to make bond issuance a little more reasonable for those types of businesses. Second, what we've done is we've created the California Capital Access Program, what we refer to as CalCap, in 1994. And that is it's a loan loss reserve program where we work with participating lenders to help small businesses get the financing they need. So it's expansion of capital for small businesses in California. Then last, and what I'm here to talk to you about today, is we created the California Recycle Underutilized Sites Program, or CALREUSE, which I'll refer to it as, and that's what Dan's referred to it as. We established that program in 2001 to provide funding for assessment of infill and brownfield sites. Kind of what Dan was talking about, the need to mitigate the financial risks associated with, next slide, please. The CALREUSE Assessment Forgivable Loan Program was designed to mitigate the financial risks associated with the redevelopment of contaminated sites by financing the cost of site assessment, technical assistance, and remedial action planning. The loans in that program started at $125,000, and that was later increased to $500,000. The forgivable loans, the forgivable aspect of it was when a borrower completed the environmental site assessment, but later determined that development project was infeasible, the borrower could receive loan forgiveness. However, if the borrower moved forward with development activities or or transferred the property within 25 years, the forgiven loan needs to be repaid to the assessment program. That's the way that program was set up. A little bit about the statistics for that program. We funded 44 loans for a total of $3.5 million. 43 of those projects were in economically distressed communities. 25 of the loans were repaid. 19 of the loans were forgiven, and we have no loans outstanding in that program, and we have no funding remaining. And I'll talk a little bit about that later in my presentation, but we are looking at ways to try to recapitalize the CALREUSE program. Talked to the legislature, and we're looking for ways to, we were very close this last year to getting financing through a general fund appropriation. However, COVID hit, and that was off the table at that point. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the outcomes from that program, because we are talking about best practices and the accomplishments of these types of programs. So next slide. Thank you. For every $1 that CPCFA funding used to finance the assessment programs, we saw $138 of additional capital invested in these projects. To date, 19 of the projects have produced over 1,100 new housing units, of which over 900 are affordable. There's also been commercial space and retail space in these projects. At the completion of these projects, we anticipate the housing production to be over 3,000 total units, of which about 1,500 of them will be at the affordable level. So as Dan mentioned, the real key to the assessment program is the knowledge gained through the environmental assessment program has enabled the private developers and local economic entities to evaluate the highest and best use of each site. That's something we're very proud of. And all but one of the projects that receive forgivable loans are located in economically distressed communities. And we did an overlay of that, and we're very proud of that outcome as well. Next slide. You'll see here's a breakdown of the location of the different projects that are in local economically distressed communities, and you can see they're throughout the state. Several in the Bay Area, north as far as Humboldt, and south as far as San Diego. So there is distribution across the state in the use of the assessment program. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about the CALREUSE grant and loan program, which is another, which is a second part of the CALREUSE program. And CPCFA received $60 million for Prop 1C, the Housing and Emergency Shelter Trust Fund Act of 2000, to administer the remediation grant and loan program. with the goal of producing and promoting the development of housing. The program was designed as a grant and loan program to finance cleanup of activities on contaminated sites. So the second level, doing the remediation. The grant funded housing projects are required, one of the requirements is that they're at least 15% affordable. The program stats on what we saw, the program stats for the remediation program are 30 projects were awarded $55 million based on factors such as cost of contamination, cleanup, project readiness, and public benefits. To date, we have dispersed $53.9 million of those $55 million. 21 projects have completed both site remediation and development. We have 9 projects remaining, 8 of which are in various stages of development, and 1 award has been returned. Those projects that are in various stages of development tend to be our larger projects, more complex, larger projects. So next slide, a little bit about the outcomes of the remediation program. For the remediation program, for every dollar in CALREUSE funding that was provided to a project resulted in a little over $30 in additional capital invested in these projects. To date, the 21 projects have produced over 2,200 housing units, of which about 80% are affordable. Our anticipated housing production is close to 5,500 new rental and for sale housing units, of which about 51% will be at the affordable level. We're proud that the remediation program has proven to reduce contamination in disadvantaged communities and low-income communities, where 51% of the projects are in disadvantaged communities and 75% are in low-income communities. And like our assessment program, we have no funding remaining. And we are doing what we can to see if we can get additional funding, as I mentioned. Next slide. Here's kind of a summary of our remediation outcomes. Looks like when the program, when all the projects are finished, there will be 800 acres of brownfields remediated, over 5,400 total housing units completed. Those are new housing units. 2,800 of those being affordable. The additional housing investment would be about $3.1 billion, which is amazing. And the number of jobs created, we're very proud of, over 34,000, and temporary jobs created, 79,000. A lot of those are construction type jobs that were created. Next slide, I'm going to highlight, this is one of the projects I know several people and lots of people, and Dan himself is very familiar with, is a Comm 22 project. This is a project that used both our assessment program and our remediation program funds. And the 130 units of rental housing for families and 70 rental units for seniors are built and available in San Diego's Logan Heights neighborhood. There are an additional 6 units for sale housing as well. There's some really cool amenities to the community here: childcare facilities, plaza areas, public art, which we've displayed a picture here. I like to do these before and after pictures. This was a former maintenance yard for buses in San Diego and was converted through the CALREUSE assessment and remediation programs to be this beautiful sign of pride for the community. For over 30 years, this community had been an economically distressed community and hadn't seen much community development. The project enabled the community to take pride in the project because of its social and environmental impacts, and I think something that we can all be proud of. I'd like to point to this slide in the middle, or this picture in the middle here, and it's not a great picture, but what I wanted to demonstrate is how many financial partners it takes to get one of these projects from assessment through remediation. And I think there's 9 different financing partners listed here. And that's the complexity that it takes to get these affordable housing, these brownfield sites turned to affordable housing projects. And I would like to reiterate that we are looking for additional funding. We have been working with a stakeholder group to put together a demand study. We did a demand study early in the year, and I think, you know, the results of that might be a lot different now given COVID. So if anybody's interested in being part of a demand study, and you feel that there's projects in your community, brownfields in your community that could benefit from this type of assistance to get affordable housing projects or community projects built, please reach out to me. Next slide. Oops, I had my contact information there, but I guess it's not there anymore.
It's in the end. We put it
okay.
On the final slide, and then Jeannie, I chatted out to everybody a tidbit about the stakeholders group, and that they can get in touch with me or with you, and we'll be glad to connect those dots for them with respect to the stakeholders group. But basically, we could, the more people, the better, right? So
that's true. And just in the short period of time that Ignacio helped us put together that demand survey back in January, we had really good results from there. And I think if we did a little longer demand study, took a little more time to do that, I'm sure we'd see even more demand. So I thank you for your time, and I'd like to hand it over to Diane Barclay.
Just a quick note before you start, Diane, just the timekeeper's role here. We're at about a little less than 25 minutes. We want to save some time for Q&A. I'm not seeing a lot of questions in there. Just a reminder to everybody, if you have any questions, please chat them, and then we'll do our best to take them and accommodate them at the end. Sorry, Diane, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks, Janie. Thanks, Dan. I'm Diane Barclay. I'm the Assistant Deputy Director and the Manager of the Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Fund in the Division of Financial Assistance at the State Water Resources Control Board. And I'm told that may be the longest job title on LinkedIn, but you know, I'm sure there might be another one. And I'm going to talk to you about how our division and our cleanup fund specifically can possibly help you with some of these projects, these infill projects. Next slide, please. So Division of Financial Assistance, DFA, is gigantic. We have 4 branches now. I think we're by far the biggest division at the Water Board, and that's because we have a lot of money to give out, and we are pretty good at getting it out the door. So we have a lot of things that we give loans and grants for. I've listed a lot of them here, such as municipal sewage, stormwater, non-point source. Safe and affordable drinking water is the big one right now. That's our governor's favorite project, but I think most of the folks here are probably interested in the remediation from USTs that we can provide funding for. And there's also a Prop 1 component in DFA for groundwater contamination prevention and treatment. Next slide, please. So under the Cleanup Fund umbrella, we have a lot of funds, not just the big boy, the UST Cleanup Fund proper, but we have our site cleanup sub-account program, which I'll talk about in some detail. We have our emergency abandoned and recalcitrant account, which I'm not going to talk about, although it is available. It's a program where we do some cost recovery with liens for folks that are not doing anything on their property, whether it's for funding or other reasons. We have an Orphan site cleanup fund account, which I'll talk about in detail, because I'm sure that'll be of interest to folks here in this audience. We also have a school district account for cleaning up school district sites, which is a much smaller account because a lot of them are winding down. And we have replacing or moving or upgrading USTs for small business owners. That's our RUST program. We'll talk a little about that too. Next. In general, for our funding, most of the cleanup funds, hence cleanup, are for contaminated properties. But we have some exciting new funds. We're not just limited to leaking underground petroleum storage tanks anymore. We've got to start there. We do have limited reimbursement for UST removal, definitely not at all on the cleanup fund side, possibly on the Orphan side, but there have to be, you know, we have to get the lawyers involved, and there have to be all sorts of special conditions there. Funding vehicles that we use, we have grants that we issue out of local assistance. We have contracts that we do through DGS and for the regional boards. We have claims that can be established and are reimbursed, and we also do some loans with our RUST program. And we have different funding limits that I'll talk about. We don't, however, do any reimbursement for demo or the redevelopment itself. Next slide. So the UST Cleanup Fund, this has been around for a long time, 30-something years. It was really established as a mechanism to meet financial responsibility requirements for the owners and operators of petroleum storage tanks. Insurance wasn't working well. And to me, this is the biggest reason the fund is supposed to sunset at the end of 2025, unless they come up with a better alternative mechanism to meet this requirement. I don't know what else they're gonna do. I think we're gonna get extended, but who knows what'll happen. Anyhow, we pay claimants, we reimburse them. It's a reimbursement program. We don't pay them up front for eligible corrective action costs to clean up from releases of petroleum only from underground storage tanks and the delivery systems. And up until SB 445 in 2014, it was $1.5 million per claim or occurrence. Now it's, since then, if you file your application after January 1st, 2015, it's $1 million that's available. We have $200 million in annual appropriations that we can pay for claims. And I'm proud to say that last year we hit that. We've been activating letters of commitment like crazy, almost 1,000 of them a year. There won't be a priority list anymore in about a year. We had another 100 million that we could have paid out if we had the authority to do it. So my group is going like crazy over there. They're doing a great job. Next slide. So SCAP, the Site Cleanup Sub-Account Program. This is, I think, our most exciting program. And we have the ability for the first time since 2015 to pay for contamination cleanup that is not petroleum. This can be things like chlorinated solvents, metals, rocket fuel, and these are the things that are really shutting down drinking water wells. If you take a look at how many are shut down, it's not usually because of petroleum, because as we all learned, that bioattenuates. So we do have, however, some considerations that we have to look at as we prioritize the sites that are coming in. I can tell you that we have a long waiting list for this program. We can't possibly fund everything that we would like to. We have to look at how much of a human health risk it is. Does the responsible party have the ability to pay? Is there a directive from the regulatory agency? And is it in a disadvantaged community? Those are the big ones that we have to consider. We can give contracts for the regional boards to go find RPs, and we have about 12 of those. We can give local assistance grants, and we have about another 64 or 5 of those. So with only 19 million in appropriations, of which we don't even have the full authority to use that, which we're trying to get, I think it's about 17 million we can use a year. We've got 78 really good projects funded. We're looking at funding 15 amendments and 15 more projects this year, but that is a drop in the bucket to what we could fund if we had more money. And I think, you know, Marcus is going to talk a little bit about that, but we have a funding source that is kind of at odds with where we'd like to go with it. Next slide, please. So the Orphan Site Cleanup Fund, I know, I looked at the attendee list. I know some of you use and love this fund. It is certain that we try to get everybody in somewhere. If you're not eligible for the big cleanup fund, we always look at Orphan next. It is a petroleum only fund. And it's a kind of situation where typically no financial really responsible party has been identified. Maybe someone inherited this problem from a relative, or maybe they bought a piece of property and they didn't cause the contamination, but they, you know, now they're faced with cleaning it up. A lot of times they didn't even know. So anyway, and not just brownfields, now we can give up to $1 million for each one of these sites. Next slide, please. Oh, I wanted to say back, sorry, that's a gateway project that we did in Carson. That was an old blighted property, and now it's mixed use affordable senior housing and retail. Those are the kind of projects we love to fund with this program. Next. So the last slide for me, replacing, removing, or upgrading underground storage tanks. This is for small business owners. We can give up to $70,000 for them to get into compliance with their system. And we can also give loans up to $750,000 for them to upgrade their systems and equipment. And we are supposed to, oh, I see a typo there. Sorry about that. That's like 10,000 years from now. But anyway, we're supposed to sunset in 2022. And I believe that AB 39 was signed into law. So now that lines up with the cleanup fund itself. So that's it for me.
Awesome, thank you. We'll transition it to Marcus next. Change the slide, please. Unmute.
There we go. All right, there we go. Marcus Niebank here. I've been an environmental consultant for many years, working predominantly in the brownfield redevelopment, conservation, transactional space. Next slide, please. Recently, well, brownfield redevelopment has always been hard. Infill redevelopment has always been hard for a variety of reasons with which all of you are very familiar. Last year, over the last couple of years, 2019 and most of 2020, the landscape has gotten increasingly complicated, as you've heard other people talk about yesterday, primarily around the changes in perspective with respect, regulatory perspective with respect to vapor intrusion. The landscape is now, it's gone from complicated to almost frozen, especially in light of what COVID has crushed down upon us. When I was thinking about the implications of the changes in VI policy last year, I was thinking about it with folks that were working to introduce better science into the process and maybe push back a little bit on what it was that was being proposed. I thought at the time that maybe a good idea a good belt to go with the suspenders, the scientific suspenders, was to see about providing a funding resource that developers and transaction people could access to help offset the complications that were going to be pressed down upon them by the changes in VI policy. And a review of what's available, and a couple of them are on this slide. The EPA Brownfields program has always been great. In California, they've usually given between $5 and $10 million a year to a variety of projects. The Underground Storage Tank Cleanup Fund is probably the most progressive and beneficial program nationally. California certainly nationally, giving out billions of dollars for the cleanup of petroleum releases from underground tanks. But as Diane explained, it has its limitations with respect to sites that aren't releases from USTs, and $19 million. Since GAP funding goes a long way and it's better than EPA Brownfields funding, but it's a drop in the bucket compared to what the market needs, especially for the construction of badly needed infill housing. I've worked with the Cleanup Fund since its inception, and realizing that it was now much less subscribed than it used to be, starting to run a surplus, going to sunset with all of its obligations taken care of, maybe now is a good time to consider reprogramming that resource. Next slide, please. So after connecting with some of my old policy, old not in years, but just in relationship, policy people in Sacramento, we got to thinking that maybe this now is a really good time to take a look at what it is that we would need to do to reprogram the cleanup fund in a way that it wouldn't necessarily turn it into a SCAP program in its totality, but maybe a real general description would be something that has arms thrown much wider than they are presently. So many sites that are being funded by the SCAP could actually be funded by the cleanup program in its entirety. The process has to be legislative, and the strategy has to involve aspects that are going to be compelling both to the legislature and to the executive. And right now with, and I would add safe drinking water to this list because, as Diane described, contaminated sites are a threat to drinking water, as well as a complication to redevelopment. But climate and infill housing development's relationship on California's climate objection, relationship to the attainment of California's climate objectives, as well as the investment in underserved communities, particularly with respect to the damage done by COVID, all of these marry really well with brownfield redevelopment in urban infill transit-oriented communities. Next slide, please. So what we have on the table right now, and I spoke to my legislator yesterday, and he is, or to his chief of staff, he's excited about this, and it really feels like something that we have traction with this session. We have bill language, and what the proposed bill is it's a two-session bill, because reprogramming the cleanup fund is not a small undertaking. It's not for the faint of heart. And oftentimes you succeed if you can break things into two pieces and get the first piece through the legislature, setting the second larger piece up for a much greater run at success than you would if you tried to do it all at once. So what's on the table right now is a bill that extends the program sunset date from 2026, January 26, it expires end of 25, to 31, just 5 years, a modest extension. It also convenes a stakeholder group to study the cleanup fund and to make recommendations with respect to reprogramming its eligibility criteria, such that it embraces a much larger universe of sites than it does presently. And some of the example criteria that are in the bill are listed here on the slide. And as it's written right now, if it goes this session, the study group will convene by July 1st of next year. And by July 1st of 2022, well in advance of the sunset date, a report from that study group would be presented to the legislature with recommendations for changes to statute that might be needed to implement what it is that's going to be described. Yes, Dan asked me if I'm looking to generate stakeholder support. I'll conclude with this. We have so little time. I could talk about this for half an hour. I have a white paper. If anybody is interested in that, you could email me. My contact information is at the end and also on the Whova app. And we are looking for support. We've got a great deal of support presently, but with something like this, you really can't have too much support. So if this is something that you think you want to support right now, let me know. If you'd like to see the white paper and think about it, let me know. I'll get that to you. But the more people we can get on board with this, I think the greater our chance of success. And yes, Ignacio, I can leave that white paper at Dan's SCS booth. And that's it.
Well, thank you, Marcus, and thank you one and all. There's a few minutes for questions and answers, and we've had a few chatted to us, and I had a few. That was a very quick spin through some pretty complicated topics, legislation and programming for potentially in excess of $100 million a year in brownfields funding, $60 million in CALREUSE. So there's a lot on the table here, and it could be really significant and game-changing for the state of California. It doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? So I think as I've been chatting out here, I think there's stakeholders, and if you have an interest, there's a call to action here to facilitate the process, then I think the chances are that we would take you up on that and enlist your help. One of the questions that I have is, to start off with, is for Diane and Janie both. In light of the dire statistics that I shared with you for the budget, what happened in the May revise? There was a gigantic budget grab to balance the budget. The cleanup fund typically clocks along at $200 to $250 million a year. I don't know if there's a statutory guarantee that that money is untouched. I think SCAP was fairly scathed in that process, which is very unfortunate. I would like somehow to get the message to the executive branch that if they're going to be grabbing money, they should take it from someplace else. The return on investment for brownfields and affordable housing from the SCAP program, safe drinking water, is huge. Why are we taking money from that program?
Well, it was the biggest pot they could find. They took $551 million from us.
Whoa.
Yeah, and that was in the May revise, and $25 million from SCAP. And remember, I talked about a gap between our authority and what our appropriation is?
Right.
That's what they took.
Wow.
So we've been trying to get that authority. You know, we're collecting the money, basically what that means is, but we can't spend it. So yeah, we took it. And then in the last one, a trailer bill, I think SB 125, that just went through, they took another $32 million from us every quarter up to The first two things have to be paid back if we need it. So I told my staff our job is to make sure we need it. The second thing is for the safe and affordable drinking water, they took up to $32 million depending on what comes in from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund auctions.
I see.
And we're supposed to make up that difference. And that does not have language in there that says it has to be paid back. So that's where we are.
That's potentially very problematic and troubling. So there may be a call to action here as we enlist the help of stakeholders to try and make sure we get that money to the right place, right? How about you, Janie?
As I mentioned earlier, right when we were getting close, I think it was February, we were talking to the powers that be about getting a general fund appropriation to recapitalize the CALREUSE program. We came very close. We had a lot of the decision makers. We proved that we could build affordable housing when affordable housing was really something that new housing development was something everybody was working, and they're still working towards that. But we were very close, and we're expecting tax revenues to come in at a high level, and then COVID hit at the end of February, early March, and unfortunately, the general fund appropriations were spoken for other purposes.
Yeah.
We're going to go back to the drawing board, and I appreciate you giving me this opportunity to, as you said, have a call to action to see what we can do to help us get that funding.
Well, the backdrop, if anything, maybe is more challenging than ever, right? Given the budget deficit and the $14 billion duct tape and baling wire. So we'll have to see how that goes. But the need isn't going anywhere. It's very compelling. Marcus, maybe the most challenging aspect of what you're trying to accomplish, well, I mean, legislation is always challenging, of course, in the political dynamic, but the nexus of what you're trying to do and what the SCAP does with the origination of the fee, which of course is a mill tax. Every gallon of gas that gets pumped, there's a mill tax. Most people are probably oblivious and don't have a clue. Right, this mill tax goes to pay for leaking underground storage tanks, but then there's the separate account that got cleaved off for SCAP. And as I would observe, we've got 4 or 5 clients and it is brilliantly successful. And it's doing what no other source of funding can possibly do in the state of California. It's getting dry cleaner sites and other things cleaned up where there's no source to get the funding done. So what do you think?
It's an interesting question. The way that I'm going about it, well, the answer has 2 parts. One is where there's a will, there's a way. And if the leadership wants it to happen, they're going to figure out a way to make it happen. The nexus, as I see it, though, and we don't have to create it out of whole cloth. With respect to California's climate objectives, there are many ways to go about attaining those objectives. But with respect to the combustion of refined petroleum products, infill and transit-oriented development reduces the commute time. We've got some of the largest commute times in the country.
Right.
By virtue of the fact that the investment is in those kinds of projects, there is a relationship between petroleum products and the expansion of this program.
Brilliant. Yeah, I like it. Why not? Yeah. Plus all this other good, right? So what good could we show in terms of this return on investment, right? Versus the the relatively insignificant amount that. Is it even noticeable what people pay at the pump, right? This is, correct me if I'm wrong.
No, exactly. And I think
2 cents a gallon, right?
Well, it's super hard to create a program like this at any time. But to have what Diane has been administering, and the fund is in such better shape lately. I mean, it's been great all along, but it's had its complications.
Sure.
To have a fully functional program that exists, and that is intended to sunset, for no reason other than that was the statutory requirement. It's a whole lot easier to expand something like this now than it would be to create something out of nothing.
The infrastructure is there, the success is there, the case studies are there. I think that's true across what you're trying to do, what the Cleanup Fund and the SCAP's doing, what CalReuse has done. I think you can there's proof of concept and funding across all of these funding sources. There's just not enough and it's not consistent. That's the hypothesis. If we can have a consistent source of funding, I think we can get significant return on investments for economic investment, reinvestment across a whole series of community benefits, right? So, but with that, I think we probably need to wrap it up, right, Ignacio? I want to thank my co-panelists, Marcus, Janie, and Diane. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks to CCLR for organizing and putting this together. Great session. I'm sorry we have to end. There's more questions. My understanding is there's a chat box for the financial track. If you have further questions that you want to pose of us, our emails are there. Pose them directly or pose them in the community thread for the funding, and then I'll do my best to get you answers, I promise.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dan, Diane, Janie, and Marcus. See you at the next panel.
Have a great day.